recorded lectures, and so you'll have all of that for your review as well. So, to fully understand Locke requires returning briefly to this guy, James II, who we talked about when discussing Divine Right of Kings. Right? He is the grandson of James I. He is the son of the king Charles I, who is removed in the English Revolution, and he's the brother of the king that precedes him, Charles I. And he becomes king in 1685. The big fear here, remember, being that because he's Catholic, there's a fear that he will align England more closely with Rome. And so rebellions against him begin to be plotted almost immediately, when in fact he does move to bring the Church of England more in line with the Catholic Church, including changes to the liturgy. There is a revolution that removes James II from power. And this is a very different revolution, though, from the one that happens 50 years earlier. For one thing, they let him live. He goes to France and he lives there for the rest of his life. And he then, sires children and grandchildren who all, stage their own individual claims to the British throne, although none of them ever obviously successfully asserted. Now, as I mentioned, this event in English history is called the Glorious Revolution. When it becomes clear, by the way, that James will have a son that will succeed him, and that son will also similarly be Catholic, plans are then made to remove him with the assistance of his daughter, Mary, and his son-in-law, also nephew, William. And they do, with the assistance of nobles, the government of the Netherlands, and other people. They invade England, they overthrow the king, and rule as dual monarchs for the rest of Mary's life, and then after she dies, for the rest of William's life. And then the rest of it sort of follows from there. They don't have any children, so then her sister Anne has to become queen, but she doesn't have any children. So in order to assure that there is Protestant succession in perpetuity, they have to bring in a German monarch who's like a fourth cousin, and pass a law that says that there's going to be a law against any Catholic being the monarch. That law is still in effect today. And on top of it, and really sort of the important point, is that they institute a constitutional monarchy over the course of really between 1688 and 1714, when George I becomes the king. So that the country goes from being an absolute monarchy under James I to less than 100 years later being a constitutional monarchy. And that's a highly significant change, because it ushers in essentially the form of government that they have in England now, or in the United Kingdom now. Except that the monarch is limited even further, and the people are empowered even more. Because remember that when they begin to hold elections under the principle of universal suffrage in the UK, they're not giving the vote to everybody, not even close. Nor, again, are they doing that here. So that's the background that's important for understanding Locke. So he is a supporter of the Glorious Revolution. And in the very same way that Hobbes is writing Leviathan 30 years earlier, as a result of what he's witnessed in the course of that revolution, which he sees as being unlawful and having unleashed essentially anarchy on England, Locke has to justify the revolution that he supports. And so the Treatises of Government that he publishes, albeit anonymously, and that date is wrong, it should be 1689, so the year after the Glorious Revolution he publishes them. Although he likely composed them earlier. These are arguments that are designed to justify removing James II from power. Because the thing to remember is that elsewhere in Europe at this point, particularly in France, it's still an absolute monarchy where the king is endowed with enormous powers. And it's only been, 40 years or so since the king in England was endowed with those powers as well. And now you're removing the king again, and you're not killing him like the last time, but you're doing this a second time, when just in 1660, everybody had sort of decided it was a bad idea and that they needed to bring the monarch back. So as the name implies, there are two of these treatises. The first treatise of government is an argument against the divine right of kings, which obviously, because if you're going to get rid of the king, you need to refute the idea that the king is in his position by virtue of God's will. The second treatise is a social contract, a contribution to social contract theory. And maybe most significantly of all, it introduces or reintroduces, depending on who you ask, but certainly in the English political tradition, it introduces the idea of divided government. And what Locke does is divide political power into two types: legislative power, the power to make law; executive power, the power to execute law. Remember, in looking at the readings from James I, these are essentially unified in James, with the exception that only the Parliament can spend money. But as he makes abundantly clear in those readings, he sees Parliament as an advisory body rather than as a lawmaking body, and he sees himself as sort of the literal embodiment of the law, and therefore he can't be below the law, or even technically speaking above the law. He is the law, and so it doesn't apply to him so much as emanate from him. Second thing is that Locke believes that legislative power is the supreme political power, that executory power is secondary. And finally, he fully states that no one is above the law, and that this includes the monarch. So if the monarch is subject to the law, then the monarch can be prosecuted according to the law and punished according to the law. And anything that you can be punished for as a normal citizen, the monarch can be punished for. The law doesn't distinguish. Everybody is equal before it. Second part of the argument is an argument for limited government. So we talked about this a little bit before, but in England then, and right down to the present day in the United Kingdom, there's no written constitution. Government is according to promulgated, established, or common law. There are individual laws rather than a freestanding constitution upon which everything else is based. Locke says that laws should only be for the good of the people. So if a law doesn't serve the interests of the people, then it shouldn't be a law, and it's not the business of the lawmaking body to pass that kind of law. Third, taxes cannot be raised without the consent of the people. This is a big one, but it has certain logistic problems that are inherent in it. So say the government wants to raise taxes, how are they going to get the consent of the people to do that? At this point, historically, in England, it's several days' journey from some member of the House of Commons constituency down to London. Could take a week to get there from, Liverpool, or 10, 15 years later from as far away as places in Scotland. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to guarantee that taxes can't be raised without the consent of the people? idea? Yes? Well, yeah, so democracy is going to play a really important role, but maybe not exactly the way that it would best play a role. So we talked before about types of democracy, and that in ancient Greece, what they had, in ancient Athens, what they had was direct democracy, where the men who were of participatory age and who owned property and who were not slaves were able to directly vote on legislation, as well as participate in trial by jury. When your country is millions of people, which England already was by this point, and for that matter, when it is too difficult for everybody to gather together, then you use a representative democracy, like we do here. So in this country, for every 750,000 people, roughly speaking, we have one person in the House of Representatives whose job it is to represent that person. And that is the way that democracy kind of enters the picture. If certain things can't be done without the consent of the people, then it requires that there be a democratic process that underwrites that. Now, at the same time, it's also true that today in the United States, when there's a tax that's going to be levied, what does not happen is that we don't call snap elections so that we can vote for the person that's going to agree or disagree with that rule, right? What we do say is that, first of all, that tax can't come into effect until the next time that the House of Representatives stands for election, and that, second of all, that they have to stand for election every 2 years, the whole House. So that's the way that it's dealt with in a representative democracy. It isn't in a direct sense, like all of the voters are going to decide at this very moment, or else this tax is not going to go through. It is, well, we've entrusted our representative to do certain things on our behalf, and if we don't like the way that he or she does it, then the next time that they stand for election, we'll vote them out. And that's the safeguard against this. Third, the legislative power cannot transfer its power. Who would the legislative power transfer its power to? Any idea? Who's the other power in the state? If the legislative power and the executive power are divided, then they are necessarily different people. If they are different people, then the danger exists that the legislative branch of government will cede its power to make laws to the executive branch of government. What do we call that, by the way? There's a specific term for that. Anyone? Dictatorship. Right? Dictatorship is just when the executive power makes law, rather than it being held accountable to a legislative body, usually a legislative body that is elected. So Locke says you can't do that. Is that a good or a bad idea, by the way? In theory, it's a good idea because it limits the power of either branch of government, the lawmaking branch or the law executing branch, from garnering too much power to itself. The counter-argument to that goes that, well, what if a situation arises in which the lawmaking process would be too slow or too ineffective to deal with a problem that, if not otherwise dealt with, could have worse consequences for the country, for the people? Locke's answer is that's too bad, basically. Other social contract theorists, probably most significantly Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was Swiss-French, believed that there were conditions under which it was suitable for this power to be relegated to the executive branch. And people would argue that because Locke provides a lot of the philosophical underpinning for the American Revolution, whereas Rousseau does that for the French Revolution, that this is a fundamental difference in the way that that these revolutions unfold. We say in this country, at no point can dictatorship be used even as a short-term solution to a problem. So even during the Civil War and World War II, which arguably are the greatest security, and for that matter, after 9/11, the greatest security crises that we've had, it was within the power of the government to declare states of emergency, but only with both branches of government agreeing to it. The president can't just decide, declare a state of emergency, and begin ruling by decree. Nor for that matter, even if there are sort of very slim circumstances under which it becomes possible for an executive to declare a state of emergency, that person is usually required, if not always required, to justify that state of emergency immediately, if not sooner, and make sure that the lawmaking body is in agreement with what it's doing. In France, during the French Revolution, you have the Committee for Public Safety, which is founded during the Revolution, which garners this emergency power to itself, and then it unleashes the reign of terror and public executions and the guillotine and all of that stuff. Now, it's probably a bit too easy of an explanation to say, well, the French Revolution was bad and failed because of Rousseau, and our revolution was good and succeeded because of Locke. But it is a fundamental difference in their ideas. If the emergency power can't be given over to the executive, then it will always stay with the legislative branch, with the lawmaking branch. There's an inherent danger in that, for all the reasons already stated. If it's going to take a longer period of time for a law to be passed that's going to deal with a particular situation that might be better handled if it were dealt with more quickly by an executive that were able to, make the stroke of a pen and address that problem. But Locke says the danger is too great, because government is best when government is small and limited. And the only way to guarantee that government remains small and limited is to divide the power and make sure that they can't be transferred. Last but not least, the purpose of government is to protect life and property. And that's it. Locke says basically that's the limit of what government is supposed to do. Protect you from invasion by foreign countries, protect you from your neighbor trying to steal your things, and when there's a dispute that doesn't involve a criminal law, but rather a law about property, it's the government's decision to decide who's right and wrong. So courts, he puts in the executive branch, whereas in the United States we keep them separate. But otherwise, it's similar to the way we do things here, or at least in theory, right? That the underlying, remember, because the basic assumption about a government is that if it can't protect you, then it fails as a government. If it doesn't do these basic things, then it can't really call itself a government at all. Stipulation on this is that lots of property is created by virtue of work. So he says, well, he gives a kind of hypothetical in the second treatise of government. It says, well, how does, because everybody at this point, historically speaking, when they're writing books of philosophy, they feel the need to build up from the smallest possible principles up to larger principles. So Locke says, well, if we're going to discuss property disputes and the role of government in settling a property dispute, we have to understand what property is in the first place. So imagine there is a public commons, a field where any person can walk or graze their animals or relax or do whatever. He says the only way that any person can claim that as his or her own property is by doing some work that has that land yield something greater than what was there before you got there. So he says, plant a tree and then pick the fruit that comes out of that tree, and you can claim that's your land. Plant a crop there, farm that crop, sell that crop, that's your land. But without work, there's no property, basically. The last thing that Locke says is that there is a right to revolution. Now, he puts this in here because he wants government to be fearful of the people rather than the other way around. This goes toward the basic assumption, which is that government should be limited in its power. If government therefore tries to garner more power to itself than what the people think is suitable or what the basic functions of government dictate that it should have, government should be in a situation where it fears doing that so that it doesn't do that. So he says that you have a right to revolt, and we'll look at that in a moment. When two conditions are met. First, that the grievances of the people from the government have to be truly significant. You can't, you can't overthrow the government because of a tax that you disagree with, but that isn't so onerous that it puts you out of business or puts you in the poorhouse. Second, the offenses have to be long-standing, have to go on for a long time. Locke realizes that governments make mistakes, so the mistakes have to be big or not mistakes at all, and they have to be lengthy in their duration. So we'll look at the Declaration of Independence a little bit later, but for now, turn the book to page 555. So in this reading, he starts with the social contract idea. Political power is that power which every man having in the state of nature has given up into the hands of society, and therein to the governors whom the society has set over itself with the express or tacit trust that it shall be employed for their good and the preservation of their property. So there's a lot in that clause, so it bears sort of breaking up into parts. First of all, Locke has this notion of the state of nature, just like Hobbes does. But in distinction to Hobbes, where he says that the nature of man, nasty, brutish, and short, right? And it's a situation of war against all, all against all, in a situation where no government exists. Locke views it as fundamentally neutral. That abuse can occur, but there's no guarantee that it will occur. And in the thought experiment that both he and Hobbes engage in, the state of nature being either negative in Hobbes' case or neutral in Locke's case, the people agree to hand over their power to governors, as Locke says in the third line, who they set over themselves, and he says with express or tacit trust, tacit here meaning not explicitly stated, that it should be employed for their good, so again, that that laws are required to be good, or else they shouldn't be laws in the first place, and the preservation of their property. So, now this power which every man has in the state of nature, in which he parts with to the society in all such cases where the society can secure him, is to use such means for the preserving of his own property as he sees good, and nature allows him, and to punish the breach of the law of nature in others. So you give up the right to protect your property, and you give up the right to punish those who violate your property. Locke says, by the way, that you don't have, that doesn't mean that if somebody tries to steal from you, and the example that he gives us, if you're, riding your horse across the country and brigands, robbers, come up beside you and demand your purse, you're allowed to fight them. You're not required to just give up and then say, okay, well, now I'll go to the police and hopefully they'll find the guys that robbed me and take care of it like that. But he does say that the minute that your life is no longer in danger, you can't fight anymore. You should go to the police at that point. So there's a right to self-defense, but it's limited in that regard. So as, and this is about 10 lines down, according to the best of his reason, may most conduce to the preservation of himself and the rest of mankind. So the basic presumption is we have our rights to enforce our property and protect our own lives within the state of nature, and we cede that to government. So that the end and measure of this power, and here, remember, meaning goal, when in every man's hands in the state of nature, being the preservation of all of his society, that is, all mankind in general, it can have no other end or measure when in the hands of the magistrate, but to preserve the members of that society in their lives, liberties, and possessions. So just, if you have the individual power to protect your life, protect your family's well-being, and to protect your property, then when you cede that power, it can only be ceded for that purpose. So if government goes beyond those minimal roles, Locke says, then it's violating the social contract. That's, by the way, also sort of another important point that distinguishes Locke from Hobbes, is that Hobbes doesn't really consider whether government can do wrong, except to say that if it does, you're just kind of stuck with it. And on that basis, and related to that idea, is Hobbes's idea that government, therefore, is absolute, that the power that government wields is absolute. It can't be bargained with or reasoned with, it can't be overruled. Because the good that it does you in protecting you from the situation of war of all against all in the state of nature is so great that how dare you ask for anything beyond that, basically. Locke says no, that's really wrong. That really, when you hand over power to government, it's only those things that you can do for yourself that you're giving it the power to do. And notice he says life, liberty, and property, and lives, liberties, and possessions, rather. And so cannot be an absolute arbitrary power over their lives and fortunes, which are as much as possible to be preserved. Arbitrary, anybody know what arbitrary means? Yeah.
Sort of undefined, every other definition.
Yeah, and here really it sort of means like with no defined justification for being done. Law is arbitrary when it doesn't provide a justification for what it's doing, and in particular then when it does so unequally among the people that the law is supposed to protect. But a power to make laws and annex such penalties to them as may tend to the preservation of the whole by cutting off those parts, and those only, which are so corrupt that they threaten the sound and healthy, without which no severity is lawful. He therefore says something about the government's power to punish, and what it has the power to punish for. So the idea here is that unless something is being done that is so bad, essentially, that it threatens the security of the entire society, that it shouldn't be illegal at all. There are two kinds of things, basically, Locke says that should be illegal. There are crimes against other people, whether against their person or their property, and there are crimes, the nature of which are so evil as to threaten the society as a whole, things like treason. This, by the way, lends itself very easily to to what we would call libertarianism, the idea that government should be so limited that it does not have the power or should not have the power to punish things like vice, if that vice does not involve the harm done to another person or to that person's property. And this power has its origin only from compact and agreement and the mutual consent of those who make up the community. So this is the social contract. We agree to give up our power to a government, but unlike in Hobbes's case, where you give up that power and that exchange is absolute and permanent, and you get protection and the government basically does what it wants, and it's considered to be a good enough deal for you that you'll take it. Hobbes says, no, that there are very significant boundaries that are placed on government, the most important of which is that it's supposed to do these basic things and really not much more. Next page, 556. These are the bounds which the trust that is put in them by the society and the law of God and nature have set to the legislative power of every commonwealth in all forms of government. Bounds here meaning the limits. How is government limited? First, so four. limits, he says, are given. We talked about these a moment ago, but here they are in Locke's words. First, they are to govern by promulgated and established laws, not to be varied in particular cases, but to have one rule for rich and poor, for the favorite at court and the countryman at plow. So not only does the law have to be common law, promulgated, established law, but further, it has to apply to everybody equally. And that's not just that the monarch is no longer above the law, but the law applies equally well to people of high and low socioeconomic status. Second, that they ought to be designed for no other end, remember goal, ultimately but the good of the people. Third, they must not raise taxes on the property of the people without the consent of the people given by themselves or their deputies, here deputy meaning representative. And this properly concerns only such governments where the legislative is always in being, or at least where the people have not reserved any part of the legislative deputies to be from time to time chosen by themselves. So this is the condition that he recognizes. In situations of representative government, where the government is not always meeting, because, and this is just sort of a side note, but an important one, it didn't used to be the case that a person's job was to be a legislator. They had their job that they worked, 50 weeks out of the year, and then for 2 weeks they go to Washington and legislate. So that sort of is what is inherent in what he writes here, although he's referring to England, it's the same case there. So when government is not always in session or always accessible to all of the people, then we recognize that the representative right applies, and that election is the way that this is protected against. Fourth, the legislative neither must nor can transfer the power of making laws to anybody else or place it anywhere but where the people have. So you, as a person who engages in election, have voted for a deputy, as he calls it, or a representative, as we call it, or a member of parliament, as they call it today, who you have ceded the power to make law on your behalf. You have not given that power to the monarch. So, again, putting it within the context in which he wrote it, which is the late 17th century, the monarch is the executive power in Great Britain, and importantly, nobody elects the monarch, right? The monarch is the monarch by virtue of birth, being the oldest son, usually, of the previous monarch. And on that basis, because you didn't elect that person doesn't have the right to make laws that apply to you. Constitutionally, that person has the right to execute those laws, but as he makes clear in stating that the law does not distinguish between people on the basis of their station in life, their socioeconomic status, or anything else, if the monarch breaks the law in executing the law, then the monarch can be punished under the law. That short paragraph, second to last on that page. The legislative acts against the trust reposed in them when they endeavor to invade the property of the subject and to make themselves or any part of the community masters or arbitrary disposers of the lives, liberties, and fortunes of the people. So government breaks the rules when it goes beyond what its mandate is. So, and that is not only if that power of the legislature is transferred to the executive, but it's also if the legislative power passes laws that don't need to be passed, that go beyond these basic functions of government of protecting life, liberty, and property. So last paragraph on that page. The reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property. In the end, why they choose and authorize a legislative is that there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the properties of all the members of the society, to limit the power and to moderate the dominion of every part and member of the society. Right? So you can no longer enforce the law yourself, nor can you set the law. You give those powers over to government. For since it can never be supposed that to be the will of society that the legislator should have a power to destroy that which everyone designs to secure by entering into society, and for which the people submitted themselves to legislators of their own making, whenever the legislators endeavored to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience. So if the government violates your property rights, then you don't owe it obedience anymore. If the government violates your person, you don't owe it allegiance anymore. Again, very different from what Hobbes prescribes. The government can do what it likes to you under Hobbes' model. And are left to the common refuge which God hath provided for all men against force and violence. Whensoever therefore the legislators shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption, endeavor to grasp themselves or put into the hands of any other an absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people, by this breach of trust they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people who have a right to resume their original liberty, and by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society. All of which is a very sort of long way of saying, well, the government violates your person or your property rights, then you don't owe it any allegiance. If you don't owe it any allegiance, then you can form a new government. And then, you can form a new social contract with that government and give over to that government the rights that you would otherwise exercise yourself. And he says, what goes for what I've said about the lawmaking policy, it goes for the executive policy as well, for the executive power as well. It holds true also concerning the supreme executor, who, having a double trust put in him, both to have a part in the legislative and the supreme execution of the law, acts against both when he goes about to set up his own arbitrary will with the law of society. He acts also contrary to his trust, whether when he either employs the forced treasure and offices of the society to corrupt the representatives and gain them to his purposes, or openly pre-engages the electors, the people who do the voting, and prescribes to their choice such whom he has by solicitations, threats, promises, or otherwise won to his designs, and employs them to bring in such who has promised beforehand what to vote and what to enact. So there's a double power, he says, that goes along with the executive violating the social contract. Because the executive, remember, has usually in the forms of government, and certainly in England at the time that Locke is writing, veto power. So there is on that basis, the participation of the executive in the legislative process, A. B, the executive can not only violate the social contract by taking upon himself the power of the legislative, making laws by decree rather than having them be made by elected representatives, but he can also bribe or threaten or otherwise corrupt the lawmakers to get the laws passed that he wants. And that too is a violation of the social contract. It isn't just a matter of the laws being made by the lawmaking body going beyond the basic limits of protecting life, liberty, and property. It's also anybody getting in the way between you, the voter, and the representative making the law. And if that person is the executive, in this case the monarch, then the abuse of power is even greater, he says. Continuing, such revolutions happen not upon every little mismanagement in public affairs, great mistakes in the ruling part, many wrong and inconvenient laws, and all these slips of human failure will be borne by the people without mutiny or murmur. But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under, and see whither they are going, it is not to be wondered at that they should rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first erected. So if the violations by the government are long in duration and serious in their gravity, that a right to revolution adheres to the people. I answer, last paragraph on that page, that this doctrine of a power in the people of providing for their safety anew by a new legislative, when their legislators have acted contrary to their trust by invading their property, is the best defense against rebellion. And the probabilist means to hinder. He says that the right of the people to revolt is actually the best insurance policy against there being a revolution, because the mere fact that the government knows that the people can and will revolt if the government abuses its power is enough of a check against government abusing its power. For rebellion, being an opposition not to persons but authority, which is founded only in the constitutions and laws of the government, those, whoever they be, who by force break through and force justify their violation of them, are truly and properly rebels. So, moreover, it's not really revolution when you overthrow a government that does these things, because they are the rebels in doing so, and not the people that rise up in revolt. And then he gives the etymology. He says that the word rebel comes from the Latin rebellare, that is to bring back the state of war. And only, he says, the endowed power under a social contract can do that. The people actually can't do that. Last page. The end of government is the good of mankind, which is best for mankind, that the people should always be exposed to the boundless will of tyranny, or that the ruler should sometimes be liable to be opposed when they grow exorbitant in their use of their power and employed for the destruction and not the preservation of the properties of their people. So he says, he ends at least this excerpt, he's saying, look, which is worse? Is it worse that there be the possibility that revolution break out? Or is it worse that there be no check on a corrupt government to garner power to itself that was not given to it by the people? He says the answer is clear. It's far worse that there be the ability of government to abuse its power without some remedy on the part of the people being available. So, as I mentioned before, part of why, I should say, we pay as much attention to Locke as we do in the United States is because Jefferson in particular was a very close reader of Locke and a very firm believer in his ideas. So, I assume that you have seen this document before. There is of course, abridged version of it in your books. But look at the first paragraph in particular. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. That second line in particular, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. So, and remember that the primary writer of the Declaration of Independence is Jefferson. So Jefferson sort of sets forth his argument thus. He says, okay, well, we are making a declaration of throwing off government by Great Britain to establish independent states for ourselves in North America. If what Locke says is true, and we have this right, then it's necessary for us to justify this right. By the way, to justify to whom? Who is this document? Who is it? Who's the intended audience? Any idea? Who does Jefferson want to read this?
Great Britain.
Certainly Great Britain, right? I mean, he wants them, he and the people whom he represents, which is to say the Continental Congress, the duly constituted legislative body of the colonial governments. They want to make it clear to the government in Great Britain that they intend to seek independence by violence if necessary, right? So yes, Great Britain is probably the primary of the audiences, but it's not likely that Great Britain is going to part with its North American colonies. By the way, why not? What's the big deal here? There's a great big ocean between us and them. I mean, what is Great Britain's interest in holding on to its colonies in North America? So much so that it fights a 8-year war over it. Yes.
Are those still resources?
I'm sorry?
Are those still resources?
Well, yeah, right? I mean, so for one thing, North American colonies have made, in particular the North American ones, because at this point, although there is some exploitation by the British in India, they haven't really dug their heels in yet. They will, but they haven't at this point. And there are, but their colonies are primarily in North America and the Caribbean, where they're mainly getting tobacco and sugar and cotton. And keep in mind a couple things. First of all, tobacco is addictive, which means that once you've established a market for it, that market will continue to desire tobacco. Right? That's what we call in economics inelastic demand. Demand that does not respond to the fluctuations of the market. Supply and demand don't matter when demand is inelastic, or they matter much less. Second thing is sugar. Anybody know what drove the sugar market, by the way? It's actually a relatively simple thing that drove the sugar market. And by virtue of driving the sugar market, drove slavery, because the main thing that was being farmed by African slaves, particularly in the Caribbean, but also in the southern United States, was sugar and not cotton. When the Spanish came to South America, they discovered coffee, which they brought back to Europe, which also is addictive and therefore has a inelastic demand, but it's bitter, and people like to put sugar in it. And literally, the demand for coffee drove the demand for sugar. Really that simply. So now there's commodities that are coming out of the New World. Oh, and then cotton, right? I mean, so if you want to make clothes out of something other than wool, which is hot in the summertime, cotton's good for that, but you can't grow cotton in England. You can't grow cotton in Europe, pretty much period, except for maybe some places very far south. Most of the cotton supply for textiles in Europe at this point, historically outside of North America, came from North Africa. So, but that was those were governments that were considered by and large to European governments being alien, because they were Muslim. And plus there were, trade disputes and religious disputes, the Crusades, all that stuff, right? Bad feelings, so on and so forth. So what do? You find some alternate place to get your cotton. You can grow cotton very, very well in the southern United States. So all of these things are making, they're not only making big money for the people that are in government in Great Britain, but they're also driving huge economies in things like textiles and making clothing, and therefore, this big market economy that Great Britain has requires this raw input, and this raw input can't come for Great Britain from its own soil. It has to come from colonies if it's going to continue to do these things. And the southern U.S. in particular is where it's getting the vast majority of its material resources at this point for these industries, and that's why it doesn't want to part with them. So yes, long digression, but yes, it is the government of Great Britain that is the primary audience. But there are two other audiences. Yeah.
Other countries.
Other countries are another important audience, in particular France and Spain. Right? France will be the primary bankroller of the American Revolution. They will lend us a tremendous amount of money, in no small part because they hate England, and so they see it as good for them. The Spanish will help as well, although less. And then, we will have people from places all over Europe coming and assisting in the revolutionary effort as well, right? Including two from Poland, Kosciuszko and Pulaski, who have famous towns named after them now in the United States, right? Two Polish generals, who at that point, there is at that point a Polish state in Europe until 1795, and it's from that state that they come, so it's being addressed to them as well. Most of the German-speaking Europe fights on the British side because of the familial relationship. So that's the second, right? The other countries of the world that the United States, or the soon-to-be United States, hopes very much will be supported, and of course they are, because really nobody likes Great Britain, because they're the top dog, the most powerful country in the world, by far the wealthiest and the most militarily powerful, And so everybody wants to mitigate that power by backing somebody else. There's one more audience. Who is it? Anybody know? Yeah.
Like the people in the colonies?
Yeah, the people in the colonies themselves. Because, and here's a really important thing to remember about the American Revolution. Why are they upset with the British? What's the big complaint that the American colonists have with the British? What is their, if you could summarize their complaint in, say, 3 words, what would those words be? Somebody other than these 3. 3 words that summarize our complaint against the British in the American Revolution. Yes.
Too many taxes?
Close. Nope. Yes. Taxation without representation. That is what the complaint is, right? No taxation without a representation. So the complaint that is made by the colonists is that Great Britain is levying a tax on them, but is not allowing representatives from the colonists to sit in the British Parliament. Why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal in part because Locke says it's a big deal. Right? I mean, so one of the reasons why Jefferson wants to sort of frame his argument for independence within Locke's basic ideas is that Locke says, you don't do this. You don't tax people and not have to submit yourself to election. And if you don't have representation in the parliament, then you don't have representation by popular election. So these are taxes. By the way, what are they taxing and why? What's that? Everything, right? But they're taxed like, so, you know, this event that happens in Boston, right, where Paul Revere and Sam Adams get drunk and they throw a bunch of beer in the harbor, or a bunch of tea in the harbor, right? Why are they throwing tea in the harbor? What are they so angry about? What is this tax that they're paying and why? Yes. Well, sure, probably at least to some extent. But so there's a new tea tax that's being levied. Who does this tax affect? This is really sort of my question. And for that matter, the other taxes, which are all basically forms of tariffs having to do with the trade that's going back and forth between the American colonies and Great Britain, right? Because most of this is being done by individual businesses or companies. Back in Great Britain, it's the British West India Company. But there's a massive oversight by the British government because they take a big chunk of the profits that come into this, right? So if they want to levy a tax on something, they can do that. So what's actually happening is that it's not a tax on buying tea at the store. It's a tax on tea being sent back to England that has to be paid by them as a tariff so that they can get their tea into the country that they're shipping. What that means about that tax is that it's a tax that business people are paying. It's not a tax that's being levied on everybody in the whole country. Most of the taxes that they are complaining about that are being levied without representation is affecting 2 groups of people: business people in New York and Boston, and plantation owners in the South, who are both small minorities among the people that live in the country at that time. So this is, you know, we call it a revolution, and we'll use these terms with better definitions 2 weeks from now, but this is a very bourgeois revolution. It is a revolution of business people and plantation owners because they're upset about having to pay a tariff that they don't get to vote on. The vast majority of the people in the country don't care. Being represented or not in the parliament makes no difference in their lives. So now what's going to happen is that the British are going to send troops, and now there's going to be British soldiers marching around, burning down villages, raping women, killing people, so on and so forth, right? They're going to have to justify that somehow because most of the people didn't want this, didn't even know that it was a problem. So yeah, that's the third audience. So what does he have to establish? First of all, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So this is also from Locke. This is the underlying assumption of the Second Treatise of Government, which is that the reason why law applies to everybody equally is because all people are equal inherently. Not that they are equal in their ability, in their strength, in their intelligence, what have you. Rather, they are equal in their representation under the law and the extent to which the law applies to them. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice that he includes life and liberty, but not property, which is odd because he was a plantation owner himself. But it is arguable that what he's trying to do is to give it a broader populist appeal, because most people, after all, the property they have is the farm that they grow their dinner on. So that might be important to them, but they don't view it as property per se, like Jefferson views his plantation and slaves and all of that. So, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that wherever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Right? That's basically just Locke. That's Locke's argument in Jefferson's own words. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind is more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under the absolute despotism, that is literally almost word for word what Locke writes. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. And then comes the list of grievances, right? The current monarch of Great Britain and the way that he has usurped his authority and established a tyranny over these states. So, and then, the rest of the Declaration of Independence, with the exception of the actual Declaration itself of Independence, and a sort of summary paragraph. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince, here meant in Machiavelli's sense of the term, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. Which just means that you're our enemies now, but when peace comes, we'll be your friends again. But it's necessary to justify the complaint not just against the king. The grievances are greater against the king, by the way, because remember, the executive power can abuse power in more ways than the legislative power can do. But it's also necessary then to lodge the grievance directly with the British people, because it is, after all, their representatives within their parliament that are passing these taxation laws. And then the General Declaration of Independence. But in terms of the actual complaints that are made, they basically come down to, you're taxing us without our being represented, and when we complain, you're mean to us. And some of that being mean is really being mean. By the time that this is written, there's the Boston Massacre already. I mean, British troops are firing on unarmed people, so it's not like this is a small deal. And it's not like, I don't want to be glib about this. I mean, it's not like, there isn't a case to be made that if you're going to tax somebody, that they should have a right to say about those taxes. It's just that, in terms of establishing the audience for this document, it really is the, more than 80% of the people who have no dog in the fight whatsoever. And they will throw their allegiance by and large behind the British government, but they will be, or with the American government, as such as it is. But at the same time, there will be a significant minority that does not, right? And a lot of those people will end up in Canada by the end of it, but they don't see any reason, for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that they may still hold some degree of believing that the king is the king by grace of God, to separate. They might see it as sinful or wrong or just counterintuitive. Why bring on trouble on yourself if you don't need to? But George Washington is a plantation owner. He is, in fact, until Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, he's the wealthiest man who's ever been president. He's probably still in the top 4 or 5, adjusted for today's dollars. He was a fantastically wealthy man, as was Jefferson. So, and then in the North, Samuel Adams and John Adams, they're businessmen. Hamilton came from New York. So these bases of power, by the way, are, they've got their own separate lists of grievances, specific taxes or specific tariffs that have been levied against what they're growing or what they're trying to send. And that's why they sort of file these grievances together. If you think back, by the way, to the video that I showed you of Jefferson and Hamilton arguing over what the economy of the United States is going to look like under the Washington presidency. And Jefferson is very much of the opinion that it should be extremely small and limited. That essentially the federal government's role should be to raise an army when there's a time for war, and end of sentence. That otherwise, what affects him should be what's done at the level of the state of Virginia. And that it should be the same for Hamilton as a New Yorker, or the same for Adams as somebody from Massachusetts. And that really, what you have in the United States is not a united country, but sort of a loose federation of independent countries that rely on each other for their greater defense, but not much else. For Hamilton, he sees this the mandate given to government as being much greater. It's not just the duty of government to protect life, liberty, and property. It's the duty of government to establish trade and negotiate treaties, not just treaties of war and peace, but treaties of trade. So if you sort of, and it sort of just, the individual complaints are not ones that are worth spending a lot of time to look over, except for this one. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This is the last and among the most grievous, therefore, of the complaints that is made by the colonists, right? They, not only are the British oppressing us in a number of different ways, but as demonstrated in the previous war, right? So you might or might not know that 12 years earlier, they had just wrapped up another war. The British and the French had been fighting each other really sort of worldwide. It's the 7 Years' War, and they're fighting each other on 4 continents, I think. But there's a significant part of that war that's being fought here in North America, where we call it the French and Indian War, where the British have recruited Indian tribes, and the French, in their part, have recruited Indian tribes as well as allies in this in a land battle, basically over what's now Ontario and Quebec. And but it also affects, parts of what's now the northern United States. This is not a problem that's gone away. Having now empowered the Native American tribes, there's trouble with the Native Indian savages. What he's not saying, by the way, is that part of what's fueling that problem is that there's increasing settlement moving west into what's now Ohio and Michigan, and that is a significant contributor to the problem. But it's notable that that Jefferson feels it necessary to mention this for a few reasons. First of all, because he makes an appeal, basically remembering that the readers of this document are not only the British government, but other European governments and the American people at large, taking the second point first, the American people at large fear the Indians a lot because they're a big unknown. And so this is going to be a good way to whip up the fear that will get support for the war that they know is going to be coming as a result of this. I mean, it's basically already been going on for 4 or 5 months, but it's going to really pick up after this. Second, it's going to play on all of Europe's ideas about Native Americans, or for that matter, non-whites generally. And it's a way to whip up their sympathy because, particularly among the Spanish and the French, this is a problem, as they view it, that they've already dealt with decisively in the case of the Spanish. But, so therefore, it's a way, again, of drumming up support. Third point about this is that when we get to the Constitution in a couple of weeks, they don't drop this issue. They keep on with it, except that they frame it in the weirdest possible way. But if you think about it, a very John Locke way of framing it, which is to say that anytime they mention the Indians in the Constitution, they always stipulate that they're not being taxed. They stipulate they say that that taxes are going to the way that the country is governed is going to be done in a particular way, accepting the Indians, but we don't tax them. And that's the excuse that they're going to come up with over and over again. We don't have to include them for all of the reasons that you know but we won't say. But what we won't do is tax them, because that's really what we would be doing wrong. If we push them out of their land, if we if we bring diseases that kill them, if we inflict injury upon them directly, for that matter, that's one thing. But what would be really, really wrong, according to the framers of the Constitution, is if we taxed them and didn't give them representation in our government, which is like a little bit a little bit too quaint for me, I think. But the main thing is that the Indians are this looming threat that they will bring in here, that they will remind us of in the Constitution, and then they will continue to keep them excluded essentially from the whole process of government in the United States until 1929, when they're finally given citizenship in the country. So, part of the reason why we get, by the way, this big long list of grievances is so that it's made clear to the readers who are familiar with Locke that we've met the conditions that Locke has set out. The grievances are several, they are really, really big, and they've gone on for a long time. And therefore, if Locke was right, then we have a right to revolt. And, for most of the people that are reading this, they're not going to care what Locke thought. The French are certainly not going to care. They've got their own guy. And if they're the biggest audience outside of Great Britain, who it's felt are important to appeal to because they, after all, are the second greatest military power and they are the biggest enemy of the UK, they're not going to care very much at all. But there's almost like a fourth audience here, which is to say that for those people in the educated classes in Britain reading this, they'll recognize this, because they'll see this as being the very condition they set down for themselves when they had their second revolution. And they'll say, well, wait a minute, or at least Jefferson is hoping. They'll say, wait a minute, we justified what we did in 1689 on the basis of what Locke wrote and published the next year. Why then do we have the right to do this to other people? And so, it will be a political issue for the British as to whether the war is really worth it. I mean, like I said, it will go on for 8 years, and it will be a bit of an albatross around the neck for the ruling classes in England. It will also, it will result in another war, but ultimately in peace treaties and trade agreements, and until the Civil War, the Great Britain will continue to get most of its cotton from the southern United States, and it will continue to be a huge industry for Britain, and they'll make a boatload of money off of it. But with the agreement only, though, that the colonies can govern themselves. Now, it also is worth repeating that what is established here in North America by the colonists upon winning their independence is what's called liberal democracy. Right? And there's two basic things that liberal democracy has. It has universal suffrage, but that of course gets an asterisk because universal suffrage in 1776 means free white property owning men at least 25 years old. The second thing is that individual rights are more important than majority rule. So that where a dispute arises between the rights of the individual and the desire of the majority, the right of the individual is supreme. This means, by the way, as a sort of a logical consequence of this, that government remains small. If you believe that the purpose of government should be the bare minimum, protecting life, liberty, and property, then what government is not going to do is provide a social safety net. It's not going to get involved in regulating trade. It's going to do the bare minimum, and the argument goes, by doing so, it will yield the greatest amount of liberty, right? Where government is smallest, liberty is greatest, goes the argument. And just to repeat a point made before, liberal democracy's evil twin, social democracy, is related, but sees the ability of government to do more than that, particularly to provide a social safety net, to do for others what they cannot do for themselves. And as I mentioned in a previous class, your governments in North America, in most of South America at this point, increasingly so in all of Western Europe, in most of Eastern Europe, in increasingly in Asia and in Africa, the governments are either liberal or social democratic governments. In the United States, the liberal Democratic Party is essentially the Republican Party, the Social Democratic Party is essentially the Democratic Party. Although until about 1965, those roles were reversed, with some exceptions. Lincoln was the first Republican president. His way of describing the purpose of government was to say that it's the purpose of government for people to do for people what they can't do for themselves. That's a very social democratic expression of what government is for. A country like, for instance, the countries in Scandinavia are very sort of established social democracies, very broad social safety nets, and very activist regulation of trade by their governments. The United States is significantly less so than those, and so much more on the liberal democratic side than on the social democratic side. And that's by design. That is based on the idea that that liberty would be greatest with government being smallest, and therefore what follows from that argument is that if government does things like provide a social safety net, that requires levying more taxes. If more taxes are levied, that has a greater negative effect on economics, as I hope we established in talking about economic power, right? The minute you levy a tax, you are putting some restraint on the ability of supply and demand to find equilibrium at the best sort of rate and level, most efficiently. And if it doesn't do that, then obviously there's going to be some casualty, whether it is less profit, whether it is less employment, however it shakes out, right? But it is worth noting that this is sort of the where the gauntlet is thrown on this.